Connie and Richard Dabate seemed like the perfect suburban couple, smiling in family photos, raising two boys in a peaceful Connecticut town. But behind those smiles hid a secret so dark that it would end in blood, betrayal, and a digital trail that exposed the truth one step at a time. Connie Dabate had a life that many would envy. She lived in a quiet Connecticut neighborhood where the days were calm and familiar, the kind of place where everyone waved to each other in passing. She worked part-time, volunteered at her children's school, and spent weekends planning family outings with her husband, Richard. To outsiders, they were the image of a happy couple, the kind that hosted backyard barbecues, went on family vacations, and celebrated every holiday with warmth and laughter. Connie carried herself with a calm confidence, a gentle woman who believed in loyalty, love, and family above all else. But sometimes, what people see from the outside is only a fraction of the truth. Richard Dabate had begun changing months before the tragedy. He became distant, irritable, and distracted. He spent more time away from home, claiming extra work hours or meetings that no one else could verify. He kept his phone close, locking it whenever Connie was nearby. It was small things at first, unusual absences, unexplained expenses, that started to chip away at the image of their perfect marriage. Connie noticed but brushed it off. She believed that after years of marriage, couples simply went through rough patches. She loved him and trusted that he would be honest if something was truly wrong. Behind the closed doors of their neatly painted house, the cracks were widening. Richard was caught in an emotional web of his own making. He had begun an affair with another woman, a relationship that had started quietly but soon became something dangerous. He promised his mistress a future, even as he continued to play the role of a devoted husband at home. To him, it felt like two lives running side by side, one built on appearances, the other on desire and deceit. But every lie brought him closer to losing control. Connie, unaware of the secret life her husband was living, continued to plan for Christmas with excitement. She had spent weeks picking gifts, organizing decorations, and preparing their home for the holidays. Family was everything to her, and this season was her favorite time of year. Her friends later remembered how she spoke about wanting to make this Christmas special, more meaningful, more connected. She was tired of the distance she felt between her and Richard and hoped the holidays would bring them closer again. Meanwhile, Richard's mind was far from the holidays. He had been communicating with his mistress, promising her that things would change soon. He spoke of new beginnings, hinting that his marriage was falling apart and that he was preparing for a life with her. Those messages painted a chilling picture, one of a man preparing for freedom at any cost. But Richard's charm and confidence made it difficult for anyone to suspect the storm that was forming behind his calm expression. As December crept closer to Christmas, Connie's trust remained unwavering. She had no reason to suspect that the man she had built her life with was capable of betrayal. To her, they were just another married couple dealing with life's pressures. She believed their love was strong enough to endure anything. But to Richard, every day felt like a countdown. He was buried in lies, and each one made it harder to turn back. In the days before the tragedy, Richard's behavior grew even stranger. He withdrew further, seemed preoccupied, and occasionally snapped at small things. Connie's friends later recalled that she looked exhausted, her usual cheer dimmed by something she couldn't name. Still, she smiled through it all, unaware that her husband was constructing a deadly plan, one that would destroy the life they had built together. On December 22nd, the Dabate home glowed with Christmas lights, a picture of peace to anyone driving by. Inside, Connie wrapped the last of the presents, humming softly as she thought about the excitement on her children's faces come Christmas morning. She couldn't have known that those gifts would never be opened by her hands. While she dreamed of family and togetherness, Richard was finalizing a plan that would turn the next morning into a nightmare, a moment where love, trust, and safety would shatter forever. The morning of December 23rd began quietly in the Dabate household. A cold winter sun filtered through the frosted windows as Connie prepared for her regular fitness class. It was one of her favorite routines, a simple way to clear her mind before the busy day ahead. She dressed in her workout clothes, grabbed her gym bag, and left the house just after 8 a.m., waving goodbye to a husband who appeared calm, composed, and ordinary. To her, it was just another morning. To him, it was the day everything would change. Richard stayed home, claiming he had work to finish. He sent a few emails, made calls, and moved through his usual tasks. At least, that's how it appeared. But as the minutes passed, a sense of unease began to build beneath his calm exterior. He knew Connie would return soon. He knew the moment was approaching when his plan would have to unfold exactly as he had imagined. Outside, the town was peaceful, unaware of the dark intentions brewing inside the Dabate home. At the gym, Connie smiled and chatted with friends, her energy bright as always. She talked about her holiday plans and her children, never once hinting at the storm waiting at home. Around 9:15 a.m., she left the class, climbed into her car, and began the short drive back. Her fitness tracker recorded every step she took, every heartbeat, silent data that would later become the key to uncovering the truth. At 10:11 a.m., a 911 call rang through the emergency dispatch center. On the other end was Richard Dabate, his voice frantic and trembling. He said there had been a break-in. He said his wife had been attacked and shot by an intruder. His words poured out in broken gasps, describing chaos, struggle, and violence. Police and paramedics rushed to the scene within minutes, unsure of what they were about to find. When first responders entered the Dabate home, they were met with a scene that seemed to belong in a nightmare. Upstairs, Richard was found tied to a chair with a rope, his shirt torn, and minor injuries marking his skin. He looked shaken, claiming he had been ambushed and restrained by the attacker. Downstairs in the basement, the horror deepened. Connie lay lifeless, her body showing clear signs of a violent struggle. There was blood on the floor, a gun nearby, and silence that felt heavier than words could describe. Richard's story unfolded quickly. He told officers that as Connie returned home, a masked intruder had followed her inside. He claimed he had confronted the man and tried to protect his wife, but the attacker overpowered him, tied him up, and shot Connie before fleeing. He said the intruder was tall, dressed in camouflage, and wore gloves. The details were vivid, dramatic, and emotional, but also strangely convenient. The detectives on scene documented everything carefully. They photographed the rooms, collected evidence, and examined the supposed signs of a break-in. Yet something about the scene didn't match the story. There were no broken windows, no forced locks, no footprints in the snow outside. The house appeared too orderly for the chaos Richard described. The wounds on his body were real, but minor, more like scratches than injuries from a violent struggle. Neighbors who heard sirens began to gather outside, whispering in confusion. The Dabates were well-liked, known for their kindness and stability. A break-in leading to murder in their quiet town felt impossible. Reporters would later call it a crime that shattered suburban peace, but in those first hours, no one could have imagined how complex the truth would turn out to be. Inside, police questioned Richard repeatedly, asking for every detail. He stuck to his story, insisting that a stranger had killed his wife and that he had barely survived. But even as they took his statement, some officers exchanged uneasy glances. The evidence in the house wasn't lining up with his version of events. His emotions seemed rehearsed, perfectly timed tears, perfectly chosen words. Why that evening, the news had spread through the community. A loving mother had been murdered in her own home, and her husband had survived an unimaginable attack. People mourned, prayed, and speculated, unable to make sense of the tragedy. But detectives weren't ready to accept the story at face value. They had seen too many cases where things weren't what they seemed. The investigation had only just begun, and already, the smallest inconsistencies were whispering a different truth, one that would unravel a carefully crafted lie piece by piece. As the house grew dark that night, and police tape fluttered in the cold wind, the question lingered in every investigator's mind. If there was no intruder, then who had killed Connie Dabate? Detectives began dissecting Richard Dabate's version of events the very next morning. They replayed his 911 call, studied his tone, and analyzed every word he spoke to officers. Something about the story felt off, too detailed in parts that didn't matter, too vague where it should have been clear. He described a masked intruder with uncanny precision, yet failed to remember how long the struggle lasted or how the gun ended up on the floor. The investigators knew that truth rarely followed such a neat script. As they examined the scene, small inconsistencies emerged. The supposed point of entry showed no sign of forced access. The alarm system had been disabled manually, not triggered by an intruder. There were no foreign fingerprints, no stolen items, nothing to suggest that a stranger had ever set foot inside. The only clear evidence in the house pointed back to Richard and Connie. It was becoming evident that the story of a break-in was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Detectives then turned to technology for answers. Connie's Fitbit, still on her wrist when she was found, became the unexpected key to the investigation. The device had tracked her heart rate, her steps, and the time of her last recorded movement. According to Richard, Connie had been killed around 9 a.m., shortly after returning from her gym class. But the data told a different story. Connie's Fitbit showed movement inside the house until nearly 10 a.m., almost an hour after the time Richard claimed she was dead. The digital record suggested that Connie was alive, walking around, while Richard said he was tied up and helpless. This discovery shifted the entire direction of the case. Investigators began collecting every piece of digital evidence they could find: phone records, computer logs, emails, and text messages. What they found revealed a secret life that Richard had fought desperately to hide. He was having an affair with another woman, and not just any affair. His mistress was pregnant. Messages between them painted a disturbing picture. Richard had promised her a new beginning, telling her that his marriage was almost over, and that soon they would be together without obstacles. It became clear that Richard's double life was the motive behind the murder. Financial stress, deception, and the pressure of maintaining two relationships had pushed him into a corner. He had tried to craft a plan that would give him everything he wanted: freedom, money, and a future with his mistress, while erasing the one person who stood in his way. He thought he could disguise it as a random act of violence. But the timeline was already unraveling. Detectives also discovered that Richard had taken out a new life insurance policy on Connie just weeks before her death. The payout was substantial, nearly $500,000. To them, it was a glaring red flag. They began to see the entire event not as a crime of passion, but as a carefully calculated plan. The lies were woven tightly together, but technology was pulling every thread loose. Meanwhile, forensic experts analyzed Richard's injuries. The bruises and marks he claimed were from the attacker appeared superficial and inconsistent with his story. Rope impressions on his wrists were shallow, more like they had been placed for show rather than through a struggle. It was becoming obvious that the attack had been staged. When detectives confronted him with the inconsistencies, Richard stuck to his version of events, even as evidence piled against him. He claimed the Fitbit data must be wrong, that maybe the time was off, or the device malfunctioned. But his explanations only deepened suspicion. The technology was precise, the data unshakable. It didn't lie. Behind the scenes, investigators began mapping out every minute of the Dabate's morning: when Connie left for the gym, when she returned, when her Fitbit logged her last movement, and when the 911 call was made. The result was a clear and damning timeline. Richard's story didn't fit reality. The truth was slowly surfacing, and it was darker than anyone expected. What had first appeared to be a tragic home invasion was now a puzzle of deceit, greed, and betrayal. Each discovery pushed Richard further into the spotlight as the prime suspect. The story he had crafted so carefully was falling apart, piece by piece, replaced by one undeniable fact. Connie Dabate had not been killed by a stranger. The truth was much closer to home. As the investigation deepened, detectives began reconstructing the Dabates' lives in the months leading up to Connie's death. What they found painted a picture of growing tension and emotional distance hidden behind their suburban walls. Bank records showed unusual withdrawals, credit card statements revealed suspicious purchases, and emails suggested that Richard was struggling financially. He had accumulated debt that Connie knew little about. Combined with the life insurance policy he had taken out on her, the motive became clearer. He had seen her death as a solution to his problems. Digital forensics became the cornerstone of the case. Investigators combed through Richard's phone, uncovering messages between him and his mistress that destroyed the image of the grieving husband he portrayed publicly. He had texted her about starting a new life together and hinted that he would soon be free. He even described how things would work out before Christmas, words that now carried a chilling weight. His mistress, unaware of what those words truly meant, believed he was finally leaving his wife. But Richard's plan had been far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Detectives revisited the crime scene multiple times, analyzing every corner for evidence. The gun used to kill Connie was confirmed to belong to Richard. Gunpowder residue was found on his hands, despite his claim that the intruder had fired the weapon. The rope that he said was used to tie him up turned out to be the same kind found in his garage, cut to lengths that matched the marks on his wrists. Every physical clue pointed back to him. Even the supposed struggle told a different story. Items that should have been knocked over during a fight were untouched. Nothing of value was stolen. The home showed signs of careful staging, as though Richard had arranged the scene to fit his version of events. Investigators compared photographs taken at the scene with his description and noted inconsistencies in how objects were positioned. It was the kind of mistake that happens when a story is rehearsed rather than lived. By now, the prosecution team was working closely with detectives, preparing for the possibility of charges. They began building a timeline based entirely on digital and forensic evidence. The Fitbit data placed Connie alive long after Richard said she was dead. Security system logs showed that he had disabled the alarm from his phone minutes before the murder. Cell tower records proved his phone had been active inside the house during the time he claimed to be restrained. Piece by piece, the timeline formed a narrative that left little room for doubt. When detectives finally confronted Richard with the overwhelming evidence, his calm demeanor began to crack. He shifted his story slightly, adding new details that contradicted earlier statements. He suggested that perhaps Connie had surprised the intruder or that he had blacked out during the attack. But the investigators had heard it all before. They knew the pattern of a man desperate to salvage a collapsing lie. Behind the scenes, Richard's family life began to unravel as well. Friends and neighbors who once supported him started to distance themselves, uneasy with the growing evidence. Connie's relatives, who had initially comforted him, now demanded answers. To them, the man who once seemed devoted and kind had become a stranger capable of unthinkable betrayal. The turning point came when a digital expert presented a detailed report summarizing all the evidence. It laid out the timeline minute by minute. Connie's return home, her final movements tracked by her Fitbit, the moment her heart rate stopped, and the 911 call that came later. The data painted a clear picture. There had been no intruder. The attack was staged. Richard had killed his wife and tried to fabricate an elaborate cover-up to hide his crime. By the time investigators handed over their findings to the district attorney, the case was airtight. Richard's carefully constructed story had crumbled under the weight of technology and truth. The betrayal that began with secret messages and hidden lies had now become a full-fledged murder case. What he thought he could disguise as tragedy had turned into undeniable evidence of guilt, and his own actions had written the script for his downfall. The courtroom was silent as the trial of Richard Dabate began years after Connie's death. Every seat was filled. Reporters, neighbors, family members, and strangers drawn by the shocking story of betrayal and deceit. At the front sat Richard, dressed in a dark suit, his face expressionless as the prosecution prepared to present the evidence that had taken years to piece together. What began as a supposed home invasion had turned into one of the most intricate cases of digital forensics the state had ever seen. The prosecution wasted no time building the timeline of what truly happened on December 23rd. They started with the facts that could not be disputed. Connie left for the gym at 8:46 a.m., arrived at 9 o'clock, and was seen by multiple witnesses. She returned home shortly after 9:15, and her Fitbit showed movement until nearly 10 a.m. The 911 call, placed by Richard, didn't come in until 10:11. That 11-minute gap between the last recorded movement and the call became the cornerstone of the case, the window where everything happened. Prosecutors explained that in those crucial minutes, Richard shot Connie in the basement after a heated confrontation. He then staged the scene to look like a break-in, tying himself with rope, placing the gun near her body, and deliberately scratching himself to create fake injuries. He deleted messages from his phone, disabled the alarm system, and tried to make the chaos believable. But technology had captured everything he thought he could erase. The defense attempted to paint a different picture. They argued that Richard had no reason to harm his wife and that the Fitbit data could be inaccurate. They called witnesses to describe his injuries and suggested that the intruder theory still held some weight. But each time they spoke, the prosecution countered with solid evidence: the gun registered in Richard's name, the financial motive, the insurance policy, the affair, and the pregnancy of his mistress. There was no escaping the pattern that tied every thread back to him. When the prosecution displayed messages Richard had sent to his mistress just days before the murder, the courtroom fell into uneasy silence. He had written about being done with his marriage, about starting over, and about wanting peace by Christmas. Those words, once meant to reassure someone he thought he loved, now stood as proof of premeditation. The image of the devoted husband shattered completely. Expert witnesses testified about the digital evidence that told the story better than any human could. The Fitbit data, the cell phone records, the alarm logs, all aligned perfectly to create a timeline of betrayal. A digital forensics expert explained that Connie's heart rate spiked moments before her death, consistent with a confrontation, and then abruptly stopped. The precision of the data left no room for doubt. When Richard took the stand, he spoke softly, maintaining his innocence. He repeated his story about the intruder, about how he fought to protect his wife, and how he would never hurt her. But his performance couldn't mask the inconsistencies. The jurors had already seen too much. His own words and actions had built the case against him, leaving his story hollow and unbelievable. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for hours before returning with their verdict. Richard Dabate was found guilty of murder, tampering with evidence, and making false statements to police. The man who once lived a double life, a husband at home and a lover in secret, would now spend the rest of his years behind bars. As the verdict was read, Connie's family held each other, their grief mixed with relief. Justice had finally spoken. Even if it came too late to bring her back, the story of Connie Dabate became more than just another crime headline. It was a reminder that in an age of technology, the smallest digital trace can expose the darkest lies. Richard had believed he could control every detail: the crime, the story, the evidence. But he hadn't accounted for the one witness he couldn't silence, the data that recorded every heartbeat, every step, every second of truth. In the end, Connie's story stood as a tragic testament to betrayal and resilience. Her death revealed the cracks in a perfect marriage and showed how trust can be destroyed by greed and deceit. What Richard tried to erase was preserved forever in the timeline of technology, a timeline that told the world who he truly was and how one woman's final steps brought justice to light.